Welcome to Headline Wednesday from Dispatch U.S. Military History Magazine, developed by trackpads.com. Each week, we take one pivotal moment from United States military history and follow it from the first warning signs to the final outcome. Today, we go to the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam in the early Vietnam War, for the story of the Gulf of Tonkin Incidents. A longer version of this feature, with fact sheets and photos, is available in the print edition, either on LinkedIn or by email. The Gulf of Tonkin was black water under a low sky, the sea broken only by white flashes of waves and the running lights of two American destroyers pushing through humid air. Inside the steel hulls, radar scopes glowed green, sonar screens flickered, and men leaned forward in the dim light, trying to make sense of faint echoes and half-heard reports. On the bridge, officers peered into rain and haze, straining to see what their instruments insisted was out there. Fast-moving contacts, closing at high speed, and possible torpedo tracks slicing toward them. Somewhere beyond the edge of visibility, North Vietnamese patrol boats were believed to be hunting too, turning the darkness into a suspected ambush zone. The night felt watchful and tense. Hours earlier, the crew had been warned that attacks were possible in these waters. The ship had already exchanged fire here days before, driving off real torpedo boats with guns and aircraft in a short, sharp fight that no one aboard had forgotten. That recent clash hung over the watch sections now, sharpening every flicker on a screen and every ambiguous call over the radio. When a sonar operator reported what sounded like torpedoes in the water, the calm cadence of the ship's routine shifted in an instant. Calm vanished in seconds. Orders snapped down passageways, gun crews rushed to their stations, and the destroyers maneuvered hard, turning and accelerating on shouted bearings meant to comb the sea for incoming weapons. The night became a tangle of star shells, churning wakes, and shouted ranges echoing across steel decks. Gunners fired into the blackness at muzzle flashes and radar echoes, sometimes seeing shapes where there might have been only spray and shadow. Overhead, pilots hunted for targets in darkness and bad weather, reporting wakes and flashes that might have been fast boats or might have been reflections off the sea. On the plotting tables, lines and symbols multiplied, showing what looked like a coordinated, fast-moving enemy torpedo attack closing in on the destroyers. Below decks, in the cramped spaces where radios hummed and headphones pressed against sweaty ears, intercept operators strained to catch North Vietnamese voices that could confirm what the sailors thought they were seeing. Every sound felt like proof. By the time the firing eased and the ship steadied on new courses, the men aboard were left with ringing ears, empty shell casings underfoot, and a nagging uncertainty about what had actually happened. Some thought they had seen clear evidence of boats and torpedoes. Others were less sure, haunted by the possibility that weather and nerves had painted enemies on their screens. Yet the messages that went out from that black stretch of water did not carry uncertainty. Those reports described attacks, evasive maneuvers, and torpedoes in the water, converting confusion into apparently solid facts fit for higher headquarters. Those facts were about to travel far beyond two destroyers and into the highest levels of the United States government. The story was already moving upward. To understand why that confusing night in the Gulf of Tonkin mattered so much, you have to pull back from the radar scopes and look at the wider map. In the summer of 1964, the United States presence in Vietnam was still officially limited to advisors, support units, and a growing but not yet massive commitment of air power and logistics. Washington was trying to hold a precarious line, backing South Vietnam against communist insurgency and pressure from the north, while avoiding a formal declaration of full-scale war in Southeast Asia. The conflict was framed as part of a global contest, not yet as a declared regional war. Any clash at sea risked becoming more than a routine incident. American destroyers on patrol off the North Vietnamese coast were not just out for a casual cruise. They were part of a pattern of intelligence-gathering missions that mapped radar coverage, tracked coastal batteries, and listened to communications along the shoreline. At the same time, South Vietnamese forces, backed and guided by American planners, were striking targets on that same coast in covert raids. These operations were separate on paper, but to North Vietnamese commanders watching radar plots and hearing explosions ashore, they could easily look like parts of one coordinated campaign. For them, the presence of American warships just over the horizon raised the stakes of every coastal clash. Lines blurred quickly. Against this backdrop, the United States Navy ran so-called patrol missions along the North Vietnamese coast. Destroyers like the Maddox, and later the Turner Joy, cruised near shore, officially gathering intelligence on radar sites, coastal batteries, and communications networks. At the same time, South Vietnamese commandos, backed and guided by American planners, were launching small raids against targets on that same coastline. On paper, these activities were separate, with different chains of command and purposes. To North Vietnamese officers watching radar plots and hearing explosions ashore, they could easily look like parts of a single coordinated campaign. The presence of American warships just over the horizon raised the stakes of every coastal clash. During that daylight engagement on the 2nd of August, the Maddox had been operating near the North Vietnamese coast when radar picked up fast-moving surface contacts closing in. The crew went to general quarters, guns were manned, and the destroyer altered course as patrol boats approached on converging tracks. When the boats came within range, the Maddox opened fire, and the North Vietnamese craft responded with torpedoes and guns of their own, turning a tense patrol into open combat. The destroyer's firepower, combined with timely airstrikes from carrier-based aircraft, quickly turned the encounter in favor of the Americans. By the time it ended, the Maddox was largely unharmed, while at least one of the attacking boats was badly damaged, and others were forced to break off. The engagement was brief but decisive at the tactical level. 2 nights later, the scene was very different, even though the ships were in the same Gulf. The sea was dark, the weather unsettled, and visibility poor as the 2 destroyers cut through the Gulf of Tonkin. Radar operators watched their screens as faint contacts appeared and vanished against background clutter. Sonar operators reported possible torpedo noises, then retracted or qualified their calls as conditions shifted and the ships maneuvered. The destroyers turned hard and changed speed repeatedly in response to what their instruments seemed to show, building a sense of motion and danger even before any enemy craft were clearly seen. In the confined mental space of the combat information centers, each new blip or echo could feel like confirmation that another attack, even a more serious one, was underway. As the sense of threat built, the destroyers responded as they had been trained to do, under the assumption that they were under attack. Guns barked into the darkness, tracers reaching toward uncertain targets that were plotted on screens rather than seen directly. Patterns of fire walked across patches of sea where fast-moving contacts were believed to be closing in. Overhead, pilots flew through bad weather, trying to spot wakes, muzzle flashes, or silhouettes of attacking boats, relaying fragmentary impressions back to the ships below. Some reported possible wakes and shapes on the surface, while others saw nothing solid in the dark and rain. On the plotting boards, officers tried to turn this swirl of partial reports into a coherent picture, showing torpedo boats attacking from different bearings. In the moment, the pattern felt real enough to justify high-speed evasive maneuvers and heavy fire. What made this second incident so consequential was not just what happened on the water, but how it was reported and interpreted as the night went on. In the early hours, messages from the destroyers spoke confidently of multiple attacks, torpedoes in the water, and prolonged engagements with hostile craft. Those reports carried the urgency of men who believed they were under fire, shaped by fresh memories of the daylight clash 2 days earlier. As officers later reviewed their own data, doubts began to surface about whether the contacts had been real or the product of weather, nervous interpretation, and the afterimage of that earlier fight. Some sonar tracks no longer seemed convincing when replayed, and some radar returns could be explained by maneuvering and sea conditions. In Washington, however, the first wave of reports had already done their work. Leaders had been briefed that American warships in international waters had again come under deliberate attack. The narrative that emerged from those early messages framed the situation as a pattern, with a clear daylight attack on the 2nd of August, followed by a more complex night assault on the 4th. Within that frame, hesitation risked looking like weakness in the wider Cold War contest. Swift retaliation offered a way to show resolve, without immediately sending ground divisions into combat. Target lists for North Vietnamese facilities were already being prepared. The turning point lay in how those doubts from the field were handled, or not handled. Instead of pausing to reconcile conflicting reports from the Gulf, senior decision-makers treated the initial, more confident descriptions as the baseline. Later corrections and second thoughts were acknowledged but weighed less heavily. The sense of threat, the broader Cold War context, and the desire to respond firmly combined to outweigh caution about what the destroyers had actually encountered. Airstrikes were ordered against North Vietnamese patrol boat bases and supporting infrastructure, and described to the American public as measured retaliation for unprovoked attacks on United States ships. The story hardened as it rose. Almost in parallel, the administration moved to secure political backing at home. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was quickly drafted and brought before Congress with a strong push from the White House. It granted the president sweeping authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. For many lawmakers, the resolution looked like a necessary response to clear aggression at sea. What truly turned the incident was the decision to treat a murky night action as settled fact and to anchor far-reaching authority to that narrative. A narrow gulf now reached deep into American law. In strictly tactical terms, the Gulf of Tonkin incidents remained limited actions. One daylight clash damaged North Vietnamese patrol boats when the Maddox fired back with the help of carrier aircraft. Subsequent airstrikes hit coastal facilities and fuel depots along the North Vietnamese shore. No American ship was sunk, and the second, nighttime battle left even the participants unsure what, if anything, they had actually fought. Yet the political and strategic consequences were vast and enduring. With the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in hand, the administration now had a standing authorization to expand the war in Vietnam whenever it judged circumstances required. Within months, that authority was put to use. Sustained bombing campaigns against North Vietnam began, and major ground deployments into South Vietnam followed. These moves were justified in part by the need to respond to aggression in the Gulf and to defend South Vietnam from further pressure. The earlier distinction between advisors and full combat units eroded quickly. What had begun as limited support deepened into a long, costly war that reached into nearly every corner of Vietnamese life and into American households back home. The connection to that August night stayed in the background but never fully disappeared. Over time, the Gulf of Tonkin incidents became a case study in how the fog of war and the pressures of high-level decision-making interact. Reviews of logs, intercepts, and recollections cast increasing doubt on the reality of the second attack. Researchers and officers raised hard questions about how much uncertainty had been acknowledged, shared, or set aside in the rush to act. For military professionals, the story highlights the responsibility to qualify their reports and to state clearly how confident they are in each claim. They must make sure that doubts are as clearly communicated as first impressions. That duty does not end when the shooting stops. For students of military history, staff ride groups, and citizens trying to understand how wars grow, the lessons are lasting. A radar echo, or a radio intercept, does not just shape a captain's next turn of the rudder. It can shape speeches, resolutions, and the deployment of entire divisions across an ocean. The Gulf of Tonkin reminds us that small engagements at the edge of an empire's reach can become gateways to conflicts that define a generation. That is especially true when darkness at sea is matched by uncertainty in the councils of power. The story remains a warning as much as a history lesson.
You can hear more narrated Headline Wednesday features in the Dispatch audio editions and continue the conversation in the United States Military History Group on LinkedIn. Headline Wednesday is developed by trackpads.com as part of Dispatch, U.S. Military History Magazine.